There is a place in central Alabama where two rivers meet, and where the land between them holds a silence so complete that the modern world seems to have forgotten it entirely. The Alabama River and the Cahaba River converge here with a quiet and steady patience, their waters joining without ceremony, folding together the way time folds together the past and the present in places that have been abandoned long enough. The peninsula formed by their union is low and flat, prone to mist in the early mornings, prone to flooding in the wet seasons, prone to a kind of soft green stillness that settles over everything with the weight of decades. Tall trees line the margins of the water. Spanish moss hangs from the branches of ancient oaks, drifting almost imperceptibly in whatever air moves through this place. The light here is filtered and diffuse, falling through a canopy so dense in the warm months that the ground below remains perpetually damp, perpetually shadowed, perpetually given over to fern and moss, and the slow accumulation of leaf litter that builds up year after year with no one to disturb it. This is Cahaba, or rather, this is what remains of Cahaba, a town that was once the capital of a state, a place that held ambition and commerce and the full noise of civic life, now reduced to a scattering of ruins, a handful of standing columns, a cemetery, and a grid of streets that the forest has been quietly reclaiming for more than a century and a half. The roads are still there if one looks carefully, still perceptible as slight depressions or as subtle breaks in the tree line, like as pathways that the undergrowth has not entirely erased despite its persistent effort. They run in the directions that streets run, at right angles and in parallel lines, and if one stands at the right place and lets the eye adjust to what the landscape is offering, it is possible to see the ghost of a town in the geometry of what grows here now. The air carries moisture from the rivers. It is the kind of air that softens wood and promotes rust, that encourages the return of vegetation and discourages the permanence of anything built by human hands. Stone survives here better than wood, and iron survives better than either for a time. But even stone eventually surrenders to the moss and the tree roots and the slow pressure of seasons. What the water does not claim, the forest does. What the forest does not claim, time does. And time has been working on Cahaba for a very long while. A visitor arriving at this peninsula today follows a single road that winds through scrub forest and low ground before opening onto a small parking area maintained by the state of Alabama, which has designated the site as a historic park. The designation is appropriate and well-intentioned, but it does little to disturb the fundamental quietness of the place. There are informational signs at intervals along paths that lead through the trees and along the riverbank. There is a small structure near the entrance that serves administrative purposes. But beyond these modest concessions to the modern world, Cahaba remains essentially as the last residents left it, which is to say, largely dissolved back into the earth, its buildings gone or going, its streets invisible to anyone who does not already know to look for them, its entire existence requiring an act of imagination to recover. To understand what stood here, one must go back not to the ruins, but to the idea. The idea of Cahaba arrived with the idea of Alabama itself, which entered the Union as the 22nd state on December 14th of 1819. The new state required a capital, as all new states do, and the selection of that capital was a matter of some urgency and considerable political manoeuvring. Several sites were proposed, each with its advocates and its arguments, and the decision was not made easily. But when it was made, it fell upon this peninsula at the confluence of the Alabama and the Cahaba rivers. And the reasoning seemed sound enough at the time. The rivers were highways in an era before roads, before railroads, before any infrastructure capable of moving goods and people across the landscape with reliability. A town positioned at the meeting of two navigable rivers was a town positioned at a natural center of commerce and communication. The Alabama River reached south toward Mobile and the Gulf of Mexico, connecting the interior of the new state to the wider world of trade. The Cahaba River reached north and east into the agricultural interior, into the cotton-growing country that was already beginning to define the economy of the region. A capital here would be accessible to the whole of the new state in ways that a capital situated elsewhere could not be. The decision was made in 1819, and almost immediately the work of building a capital began. Land was surveyed and platted. Streets were laid out in a grid. Our lots were sold and titles transferred. Builders arrived with timber and tools. Merchants arrived with goods. Lawyers arrived in anticipation of courts. Physicians arrived in anticipation of patients. The population of the new town grew with the particular speed of ambition, of a place that believed itself to be at the beginning of something important, that felt the future arriving with each new boat that rounded the bend of the Alabama and tied up at the landing. The streets were given names that carried aspiration and formality in equal measure. There was Vine Street and Oak Street. There was Capitol Street, named for what stood or was expected to stand at its far end. There was Pickens Street, named for a political figure of the era, and other streets named for the men who wielded influence in the early years of the state. The grid was regular and deliberate, the kind of grid that expresses confidence in permanence, that assumes the town built upon it will endure long enough to fill out every block and justify every name. It was the grid of a place that expected to grow, that expected to matter, that had no conception of its own brevity. The Capitol building itself was begun in 1820. It was a modest structure by the standards of later state capitals, but it was substantial enough for its time and place, built of brick and set upon ground that the founders believed to be suitable for such a building, despite the proximity of the rivers. The legislators who gathered in it for the first sessions of the Alabama General Assembly were men who had come from older states, from Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, from men who carried with them both the political habits of older American institutions and the restless ambition that had driven them westward to a new state on the edge of what was then the American frontier. They sat in this building and wrote the laws of Alabama and conducted the business of governance with the earnestness of people who believed that what they were doing would endure. Around the Capitol, the town continued to build itself. Hotels appeared to accommodate travelers and legislators and the various people drawn to any seat of government. A tavern or two established themselves along the main commercial streets. Churches rose because the founding population brought its faith with it as surely as it brought its furniture and its livestock. A market operated on certain days. Craftsmen of various kinds set up their workshops. A newspaper was eventually established, providing the town with both information and a sense of its own importance. The daily life of an early American town assembled itself piece by piece on this peninsula between the rivers, and for a few years it must have seemed entirely plausible that Cahaba would become what its founders intended it to be. But the rivers that had made the site attractive as a capital also made it dangerous as a home. The Alabama and the Cahaba were not predictable neighbors. In the wet seasons, when rainfall accumulated in the vast drainage basin to the north and east, the rivers rose with a force and a thoroughness that gave no quarter to anything built on low ground. The peninsula between them, so advantageously positioned in terms of commerce, was also the lowest land in the immediate vicinity, and low land collects water when the rivers exceed their banks. In the early years of the town, flooding was already a recurring problem. Streets that had been laid out in optimistic straight lines became channels for moving water. The cellars of buildings filled and remained filled for days or weeks. The soil, saturated for extended periods, became unstable in ways that affected foundations and encouraged the growth of mold and the spread of illness. The summers brought heat of a kind that the settlers from the upper south were not entirely prepared for. Heat combined with humidity that made the river lowlands nearly unbearable for months at a time. Mosquitoes bred in the standing water, left by floods and in the natural marshes along the riverbanks, and the diseases they carried took a steady toll on the population. Malaria was a persistent presence, called by the various names that the era applied to its symptoms: fever and ague, swamp fever, intermittent fever. It weakened people, killed some of them, and created a general atmosphere of physical precariousness that made life on the peninsula harder than it appeared on any map or in any legislative resolution. The flooding of 1820 was notable. The flooding of 1821 was worse. Each successive inundation reminded the town's residents and the state's legislators that the site had been chosen with an optimism that the rivers did not share. Water came in through the doors of houses. It covered the lower streets to depths that made travel impossible. It left behind mud and debris and the lingering smell of organic decay that the summer sun baked into a pervasive reminder of what had happened and what could happen again. Each time the water receded and the town dried out, there were those who argued that this was a sufficient sign that the capital should be moved to higher, drier ground. And each time, the argument was resisted by those whose property values and commercial interests were tied to the current location. The argument about the capital continued through the early 1820s, with the periodic urgency that floods gave it and the periodic subsidence that dry seasons allowed. Letters were written, petitions were submitted, legislative debates were held. And during all of this, the town continued to function as a capital, continued to hold its sessions and conduct its business. It continued to grow in population, even as it struggled with its physical circumstances. There is something almost admirable in the persistence of it, in the willingness of the people who built their lives there to go on building, despite the evidence that the rivers had their own intentions for the land. The streets of Cahaba in those years would have presented a picture of raw American ambition mixed with raw American difficulty. The main commercial street, lined with wooden storefronts and the occasional more substantial brick building, would have been busy during the legislative sessions with the particular noise and movement of a political town, with horses tied at hitching posts and men in the clothing of the era moving purposefully between the capital and the taverns and the offices of lawyers and land agents. During the floods, those same streets would have been silent except for the sound of moving water and the occasional creak of a building settling under the weight of saturation. The Capitol building stood through all of this, its brick walls absorbing the moisture of successive floods, its foundations adjusted repeatedly to compensate for the softening ground. The legislators who met within it were aware of the irony of deliberating about the future of a state from a building that was itself uncertain of its future. Some of them advocated passionately for relocation. Others defended the current site with arguments about investment already made, about contracts and expectations and the disruption that moving would cause. The debate became one of those political arguments that grinds on for years past the point where its outcome should have been obvious to everyone involved. By 1826, the legislature had finally resolved the question in favour of relocation. The capital would be moved to Tuscaloosa, a town further to the north, and situated on higher ground above the Black Warrior River, a site that offered the benefits of river access without the particular vulnerability to flooding that had plagued Cahaba from the beginning. The decision was made, and in 1826, the functions of state government were transferred. The legislators and their staffs departed, and Cahawba ceased to be the capital of Alabama after only a few years in that role. And the departure of state government from a town that had organized itself around that government is a particular kind of wound. The town does not die immediately. People remain who have built their lives there for reasons unconnected to the capital. Merchants who serve the agricultural region around the confluence of the rivers do not necessarily lose their customers when the legislators leave. Farmers who have settled the surrounding countryside still need the services a town provides. And so Cahawba did not end in 1826. It contracted, certainly. The lawyers who had come for the courts followed the courts to Tuscaloosa. The political figures who had maintained establishments in the capital city relocated to the new capital. The population that had gathered around the business of government dispersed. But a residual town remained, and in some ways, the town that remained after 1826 was a more genuine reflection of what the region actually needed than the artificially inflated capital city had been. Cahawba became a county seat, the seat of Dallas County, and this role gave it a continuing administrative function that justified the maintenance of courts and offices and the various institutions that county government requires. It also remained a commercial center for the agricultural hinterland, a place where cotton grown on the surrounding plantations was collected and shipped downriver to Mobile and eventually to the textile mills of England and New England. The cotton economy of central Alabama was expanding rapidly in the 1830s and 1840s, and Cahawba's position at the confluence of two navigable rivers made it well suited to participate in that expansion. Cotton warehouses appeared along the riverfront. Factors and merchants established themselves to handle the buying and selling of the crop. A steamboat trade developed, with vessels making regular runs between Cahawba and Mobile, carrying cotton south and bringing manufactured goods north. The streets of the town during this period of its second life would have looked and felt different from the streets of the capital years. The political urgency was gone, replaced by a more settled commercial character. Families who had committed to the place put down deeper roots. Houses were built with more permanence than the hastily erected structures of the early days, with proper foundations and proper attention to the details of construction. Gardens were planted and tended. Churches established congregations that grew and deepened over years of shared worship and shared grief. Schools were organized for the children of the town and the surrounding countryside. The cemetery that still exists at Cahawba today preserves some record of these families and their lives. Headstones mark the deaths of people who lived in the town during its various phases, from the earliest settlement through the years of its decline, and the inscriptions on those stones carry the compressed biographies of individuals who built their existences on this peninsula and whose bodies were committed to its earth. There are the stones of children, numerous as they always are in 19th century cemeteries, testifying to the mortality rates of an era without antibiotics, without clean water systems, without the medical knowledge that would come later. There are the stones of adults who lived long lives and died in their beds in the town they had chosen, who watched Cahawba change around them over decades and who knew the place in ways that no visitor can recover. The cemetery sits under old trees, their roots moving slowly through the earth beneath the graves, their canopies filtering the light that falls on the stones in patterns that shift with the hours and the seasons. In the morning, the light comes low and golden through the eastern trees and illuminates the inscriptions on the stones with a particular clarity. In the afternoon, the canopy deepens and the stones exist in a greener, more diffuse light. In all seasons, the cemetery is quiet in the way that only places long removed from the living world can be quiet. A quietness that is not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something else, something that the living instinctively recognize and before which they tend to lower their voices. The town that grew through the 1830s and into the 1840s was also a town built upon the institution of slavery, a fact that shaped every aspect of its existence in ways both visible and invisible. The cotton economy that sustained Cahaba was an economy built on enslaved labor, and the enslaved people who worked the surrounding plantations and who worked in the households and businesses of the town itself were an essential part of its population, even as they were denied the civic identity that the town's free residents enjoyed. They walked the same streets, breathed the same river air, endured the same floods, built the same buildings. Their labor created the wealth that the town's prosperity expressed, and their presence was woven through the life of the community in ways that the historical record only partially captures. The streets of Cahaba that one can trace today in the subtle depressions of the earth were streets that enslaved people walked. The cotton that moved through the warehouses along the riverfront was cotton that enslaved people had planted and tended and harvested. The houses that stood along those streets, some of which are now archaeological sites, and some of which are entirely lost, were houses that enslaved people had built and maintained and served in. The history of Cahaba is incomplete without this recognition, and the quietness of the place today carries within it not only the erasure of ambition and prosperity, but also the erasure of suffering, the erasure of lives that were never given the dignity of historical prominence, but that were as real and as consequential as any other lives lived on this ground. The rivers continued to flood. Through the 1830s and 1840s, the pattern that had driven the capital away reasserted itself with regularity. The Alabama and the Cahaba rose in the wet seasons and covered the low streets and entered the ground floors of buildings and reminded the town's residents that their home existed at the sufferance of the water. Each flood was followed by cleanup and rebuilding and the resumption of ordinary life, and the town persisted, because the rivers also provided the commercial infrastructure that gave the town its reason for being. The boats that arrived at the landing after the floods brought goods and news and the connection to the larger world that sustained the population through the difficulties of the place. There is a particular quality to life in a place that floods repeatedly and is repeatedly rebuilt, a quality of resilience combined with a kind of fatalism, an acceptance of cyclical loss that becomes woven into the temperament of the community. The people of Cahaba in the middle decades of the 19th century were not naive about their circumstances. They knew the rivers. They had watched their neighbors' possessions float away. They had walked through water in their own kitchens and slept in upper rooms while the lower floors were submerged. And still they stayed, and still they built, because the alternatives available to them were various, and none of them was clearly better, and because human beings have a powerful tendency to remain where they have already invested their lives. The commercial peak of Cahaba's second life came in the late 1840s and early 1850s, when the cotton economy of central Alabama was producing at levels that filled the warehouses along the river and kept the steamboats busy on their runs to Mobile. The town had a population of several hundred people at its most active, a modest number by the standards of larger American cities, but substantial for a town in a rural agricultural county. And it supported the range of businesses and institutions that such a population required. There were general stores carrying the full range of goods that plantation households needed: fabric and tools and medicines and hardware, and the small luxuries that made life in a remote place feel connected to the civilized world. There were lawyers' offices handling the contracts and disputes and estate matters of the region's planter class. There were physicians attending to the medical needs of the town and the surrounding countryside. their remedies often inadequate to the diseases that the rivers and the climate produced, their presence nonetheless essential to the confidence of the community. The social life of the town organized itself around the institutions that social life organizes itself around everywhere: the churches, the courthouse, the informal gatherings in commercial establishments, the occasional public event that drew people from across the county. Church attendance in an era without other organized social gathering served functions beyond the purely religious, providing weekly occasions for the exchange of news and the maintenance of social relationships across the distances that separated farms and plantations. The courthouse served a similar function when court was in session, drawing people to the county seat for legal business and for the social interactions that court days facilitated. A town like Cahawba at its height was the centre of a social world that extended well beyond its own boundaries, the place toward which the surrounding countryside oriented itself for commerce and governance and connection. And then the great national conflict arrived, and everything changed in the way that everything changes when a war comes to a community that thought itself removed from the forces that produce wars. The secession of Alabama from the Union in January of 1861 and the subsequent formation of the Confederate States of America drew Cahawba and its residents into a war that would reshape the entire landscape of their lives. The men of the town and the surrounding county enlisted in Confederate regiments, with the speed that patriotic fervor and social pressure combined to produce. Fathers and sons departed together in some cases, neighbors in others, leaving behind women and children and old men and the enslaved people whose status was, nominally at least, the central issue of the conflict. The streets of Cahawba in the early months of 1861 would have carried the particular mixture of excitement and dread that accompanies the beginning of any war, before the actual scale of the dying has revealed itself, when departure still looks something like adventure. As the war continued, and its true nature became clear in the casualty lists that arrived at every post office in the South, the mood in the town would have grown darker and more desperate. Husbands and sons and brothers were dying in Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia and Mississippi, dying in numbers that no one had anticipated when the regiments were raised, dying of wounds and disease in the proportions that 19th century warfare produced. The women left behind managed farms and households and businesses with a competence born of necessity. The town's economy constricted as the war consumed resources and disrupted the commercial networks that had sustained it. But it was in 1863 that Cahawba's role in the war became most specific and most consequential, when the Confederate authorities established a military prison on the grounds of an unfinished warehouse near the riverfront. The prison was given the name Castle Morgan in honor of the Confederate cavalryman John Hunt Morgan, and it was intended to hold Union prisoners of war, the captured soldiers of the Federal armies who were accumulating faster than the Confederate prison system could accommodate them. The warehouse building that became Castle Morgan was substantial in its dimensions, roughly 125 feet long and nearly as wide, and an open structure that had been intended for the storage of cotton and that was now repurposed for the confinement of human beings. It stood near the bank of the Alabama River, within sight of the same water that had flooded the town's streets so many times, in an area of the peninsula that was particularly low and particularly susceptible to the inundations that the rivers produced. There was a wooden stockade fence surrounding the building, enclosing a yard that was adequate in area for the number of prisoners the facility was designed to hold, but which would prove catastrophically inadequate for the numbers that it actually held as the war continued. The first prisoners arrived in the summer of 1863, And the population of the prison grew steadily through that year and into 1864 as the war's rate of capture accelerated. And men who had enlisted in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and New York and Pennsylvania found themselves confined in this low-lying Alabama town, far from everything familiar, subject to conditions that deteriorated as the war placed increasing strain on the Confederate government's ability to supply its own soldiers, let alone its prisoners. Food was scarce and often of poor quality. Medical care was minimal. Clean water was a constant problem on ground that sat between two rivers and that collected the effluent of hundreds of confined human beings. Disease moved through the prison with the efficiency that crowded, unsanitary conditions always produce for disease. The numbers at Castle Morgan grew to proportions that made the suffering systematic rather than incidental. At the prison's peak capacity in the winter of 1864 and into 1865, the facility held somewhere in the vicinity of 3,000 men in a space that had been constructed with a far smaller number in mind. 3,000 human beings in an enclosed space that was barely large enough for a fraction of that number in the wet and cold of an Alabama winter, with insufficient food and insufficient medicine, and the rivers rising periodically and sending water across the already compromised ground of the compound. The prisoners slept where they could find space, on the ground or on makeshift platforms in the main building and in the yard when the building was full. They organized themselves with the spontaneous social intelligence that humans display in extremity, creating informal systems of governance and mutual support, sharing whatever resources they managed to accumulate, maintaining whatever dignity the circumstances permitted. They had names and histories and families waiting for them at home in the northern states, and many of them kept diaries or wrote letters when materials could be obtained, creating records of their experience that survived the war and that constitute some of the most detailed documentation of life at Castle Morgan. Those records describe hunger in terms that make it specific and physical, a continuous presence rather than an occasional discomfort. They describe the cold of the winter months in a building with no adequate heating, the particular misery of damp cold that the river climate produced. They describe illness moving through the crowded space. Men who had been healthy when captured, growing thin and feverish and dying before the eyes of their companions. They describe the flooding of the compound when the Alabama River rose, the water coming in through the stockade fence and covering the ground and forcing the already miserable prisoners to climb onto whatever elevated surfaces existed, to spend hours or days with their feet out of the water, while the river demonstrated once again that this peninsula existed at its pleasure. And they describe the landscape around the prison, the Alabama River visible from certain vantage points, the trees of the Alabama bottomlands, the quiet streets of the half-empty town that had been declining since the capital left decades before, a town that must have looked to the imprisoned men of the Union Army like the very image of a place that had given up, a place that matched in its outward appearance the condition they felt within themselves. The guards at Castle Morgan were Confederate soldiers, many of them older men, or those unfit for frontline service, and their relationship with the prisoners was complex in the ways that the relationships between captors and captives are always complex, shaped by military obligation and personal inclination, and the shared humanity that no uniform and no ideology can entirely suppress. There were guards who were brutal, and guards who were indifferent, and guards who showed what kindness the system permitted, who looked the other way when prisoners engaged in the small acts of procurement and barter that supplemented their official rations, who recognized in the men across the stockade fence human beings not entirely unlike themselves. The town of Cahaba around the prison was a town in wartime, which meant a town depleted of its men and sustained by its women and its older residents. The families who remained watched the prison compound from whatever distance their daily lives required, heard the sounds of thousands of confined men, were aware of the suffering within the stockade in ways that proximity makes unavoidable. Some residents of the town brought food to the prison gates in gestures of humanitarian impulse, small acts of generosity within a system that generated suffering at scale. Others maintained a distance born of military loyalty or personal distaste, or the simple unwillingness to confront what was happening within sight of their homes. The war ended in April of 1865, and with it ended the operation of Castle Morgan. The prisoners who had survived were released and made their way home by whatever routes were available in the chaotic immediate aftermath of Confederate surrender. Some of them were in conditions so compromised by months or years of captivity that the journey home was itself an ordeal. Men weakened by hunger and disease making their way across a landscape equally exhausted by 4 years of war. Those who reached their homes in the northern states carried with them memories of the Alabama Peninsula, of the rivers and the trees and the low ground and the misery of the prison. Memories that they would carry for the rest of their lives, and that some of them committed to paper, in memoirs and regimental histories that preserved the experience for those who came after. The ground where Castle Morgan stood is now part of the quiet landscape of the Cahawba Historic Site. Nothing of the structure itself remains above ground, but archaeological investigation has revealed the outlines of the building in the soil, the brick and mortar foundations that the earth has absorbed over a century and a half. The riverside location is still low and still subject to flooding when the Alabama rises. The trees that shade it today are the descendants, perhaps, of trees that were visible to the prisoners in 1864. And the river that moves past it is the same river that the prisoners watched and that periodically came to visit them in their confinement. The same river, in the same channel, between the same banks, flowing as it always has toward Mobile and the Gulf, carrying everything that rivers carry without memory and without judgment. After the war, Cahawba faced the particular challenges of a southern town in the immediate post-bellum period, challenges both economic and social that the end of slavery had generated, and that the political upheaval of Reconstruction complicated further. The plantation economy that had sustained the town's commercial life was disrupted by emancipation, reorganized slowly and imperfectly into sharecropping and tenant farming systems that preserved many of the material inequalities of the slave era in new legal forms. The freed people of the region, former slaves who now had legal standing as citizens, if not yet the full practical enjoyment of citizenship, were navigating the extraordinary transition from bondage to freedom in conditions of poverty and hostility that the political promises of Reconstruction could not fully overcome. For Cahawba itself, the post-war years brought a continuation of the decline that had begun when the capital moved in 1826. The commercial activity of the cotton economy recovered slowly and imperfectly. The river trade that had given the town its commercial rationale was beginning to face competition from a new technology that would ultimately prove more consequential for the economic geography of the South than any river system. The railroads were coming. The railroad arrived in the Dallas County area, but it did not arrive at Cahawba. The routing decisions of railroad companies in the post-war South were made on the basis of topography and economics and the influence of various towns and interests competing for the infrastructure that would determine commercial dominance for generations. Cahawba, sitting on its low peninsula between two rivers, was not an attractive location for railroad construction. The ground was soft and flood-prone. The approaches from the surrounding higher land were complicated, and the town itself had been declining in population and commercial importance for decades. The railroad went elsewhere, to Selma, and to other towns that could offer more reliable ground and better commercial prospects. The decision was not made with malice, and not made with any particular awareness of what it meant for Cahawba. But railroad routing was a business decision made by engineers and investors who cared about grades and bridges and profit margins, not about the histories and aspirations of the towns they passed over. But for Cahawba, the decision was consequential in the way that the withholding of a life-sustaining resource is always consequential. Towns in the late 19th century that found themselves without railroad access found themselves without a future. Commerce moved by rail, and the towns the rails bypassed became progressively more marginal, progressively more difficult to sustain, progressively more given over to the slow attrition of population that continued until the last reasons for remaining had been exhausted. The population of Cahawba through the 1860s and 1870s dwindled with the consistency of a process that had become irreversible. Families who had been there for decades packed what they could take and moved to Selma or to other towns along the railroad lines where economic life was more viable. Young people who might have remained to build their futures in the town instead followed the opportunities that the railroad had moved elsewhere. The businesses that depended on a certain density of customers found that density declining below the threshold of viability and closed or relocated. Each departure made the next one more likely, as the social and commercial fabric of the town thinned to the point where it could no longer sustain the investments in community life that keep people committed to a place. The courthouse, a symbol of the town's continuing administrative function as county seat, remained through this period, and with it remained the minimum institutional life that a county seat requires. But even this anchor proved insufficient to hold the population against the forces pulling it away. In 1866, Dallas County moved its county seat to Selma, which had the railroad and the commerce and the future that Cahawba no longer had. With this move, Cahawba lost its last significant administrative function, its last institutional reason to exist as a town, rather than merely as a collection of private residences. After 1866, those who remained in Cahawba were there for personal, rather than institutional reasons. They owned land. They had built houses and planted orchards and laid out kitchen gardens that represented years of labour. They had buried their dead in the cemetery and maintained the relationships of neighbourhood and friendship that sustain human life in all circumstances. They were not fools persisting blindly in an obviously untenable situation. They were people making the calculation that their lives were rooted here in ways that relocation could not easily replicate, that the costs of leaving exceeded the costs of staying. The streets of the town in the 1870s and 1880s were increasingly quiet, increasingly given over to grass and weeds, as the buildings along them were abandoned or demolished for their materials, increasingly visible as streets only in the memory of those who had walked them when they were busy. The lots that had once been built upon now showed only the slight irregularities of old foundations beneath the encroaching vegetation. The commercial heart of the town had ceased to beat. What remained was residential, scattered, and shrinking. The flooding that had always been part of life on the peninsula continued, and without the institutional and commercial infrastructure that had once absorbed the periodic losses and funded rebuilding, each flood was more difficult to recover from. A building damaged by water in a declining town is a building unlikely to be repaired, because repair requires resources and confidence in the future that a declining town cannot easily generate. So the damaged buildings were abandoned rather than fixed, and the abandoned buildings deteriorated faster than the occupied ones, and the landscape of the town shifted steadily toward ruin. The major flood of 1874 was particularly devastating, covering the entire low-lying peninsula to depths that rendered virtually the entire town uninhabitable for days. When the water receded, the mud it left behind was deep and persistent, and the damage to the remaining buildings was severe. Some families who had stayed through all the previous floods and all the previous decades of decline finally made the decision that enough was enough, that the combination of flooding and isolation and the absence of economic opportunity had finally overcome the reasons for staying. They packed their belongings and joined the long departure that had been going on since 1826, adding their names to the list of those who had built lives on the peninsula, and ultimately concluded that the peninsula was not a place where lives could be sustained indefinitely. Each family that left took something of the town with it, not just possessions, but memory and relationship, and the accumulated knowledge of the place that only long residence produces. The people who left Cahawba knew where the ground flooded first and where it held. They knew which trees were likely to come down in storms and which had root systems deep enough to hold. They knew the schedule of the river's moods through the seasons, the signs that preceded a rise, the rate at which the water moved when it came. All of this knowledge, accumulated over decades and generations, left with the families when they left, and what remained behind was increasingly a place without anyone to know it. The late 19th century saw Cahawba reduced to a handful of families living among the ruins of a much larger community. The cemetery continued to receive its dead from these final residents, continuing the record that had begun with the earlier settlers. Houses stood in various states of repair and disrepair among the spaces where other houses had stood and fallen. The streets were there in the earth, but no longer in any functional sense, their surfaces broken by the roots of encroaching trees, their edges dissolved into the surrounding vegetation. The people who remained in these final years of habitation were living in a place that had become something other than a town, something between a memory and a landscape, a space that retained the physical traces of its history, but had lost the animating presence that makes a collection of buildings a community. They must have been aware of this, must have felt the weight of the absences around them, the missing neighbours and the missing buildings and the missing noise of a fuller life. Whether this awareness produced melancholy or simply became the texture of ordinary existence, part of the way things were rather than a cause of active suffering, is something that the historical record does not clearly reveal. The last families appear to have departed Cahawba in the early years of the 20th century, though the historical record is imprecise about the exact timing and the exact identities of the final residents. There was no dramatic last day, no formal ceremony of departure, no moment when anyone announced that the town was officially over. People simply left, as they had been leaving for 70 years, one family at a time, until there was no one left to be the last one to leave. Or rather, until whoever was last to leave did so without any particular awareness that they were closing a chapter that would never be reopened. After the last residents departed, the forest moved in with the thoroughness that forests display when given unchallenged time. The wooden buildings, already in various stages of deterioration, continued their return to the earth. Roofs collapsed under the weight of seasons, exposing interiors to the rain and the accelerated decay that exposure produces. Walls followed, their foundations undermined by root growth and by the repeated wetting and drying that unprotected brick endures. The vegetation that had been kept back by human occupation moved into the spaces the buildings left, claiming the floors and the lots and the yards with the quiet efficiency of natural process. And the streets persisted better than the buildings. the earthen roadbeds compressed by generations of traffic maintaining a slight resistance to the encroaching vegetation, remaining legible in the landscape as slight linear depressions that a knowledgeable eye can still follow. But they lost their identity as streets over the decades of abandonment, becoming simply features of the terrain, indistinguishable from natural irregularities to anyone who did not know what they had been. What survived best was what was built to survive: the brick and stone structures, the cemetery monuments, the earthen works that time treats less aggressively than it treats wood, the columns of certain buildings, constructed of durable materials and robust enough in their original engineering to resist the forces of decay. I remained standing after everything around them had fallen. There is a set of Corinthian columns, the remains of what had been a substantial private residence, that stand today in the vegetation at Cahawba, and that have become, in the popular imagination, one of the defining images of the place. The image that appears on the signs at the entrance to the historic site, and that has been photographed thousands of times by visitors who come to see the ruins. The columns stand slightly apart from each other now, no longer connected by the structure they once supported, their capitals reaching up through the tree canopy, with a classical formality that is entirely incongruous with the surrounding forest, a fragment of human ambition preserved by the durability of its materials, while everything else has dissolved. Those columns, rising from the undergrowth of the Alabama bottomlands, carry within their stone the compressed history of everything that stood here. They were cut and carved and set in place by human hands, hands that belong to specific people with specific names and histories that the historical record preserves only partially. They supported a building in which people lived their daily lives, had their meals and their conversations and their sleep and their grief, in a town that expected to last forever and lasted barely a century in any active form. They have been standing in the forest longer now than the town they were part of was an inhabited place, their stone more patient than the human purposes that brought them here, outlasting by far the ambitions they were built to express. The cemetery at Cahawba has been maintained with varying degrees of diligence over the decades since the last residents left. The state of Alabama and local historical organizations have at various times invested in clearing the vegetation from the stones and repairing those that have fallen or cracked, and the cemetery today is one of the most legible parts of the site, its stones still bearing their inscriptions for those who take the time to read them. The names on the stones are the names of the people who built and inhabited this town, and to walk among them is to encounter the town's population in the only form in which it now exists, as names carved in stone, as dates of birth and death, as the brief epithets and scripture verses that the era customarily inscribed on memorials. There are children here who died before they could know the town they were born in, who never walked the streets that can still be traced in the earth. There are adults who lived through the full arc of the town's history, who were born when it was still a going concern, and died when it was already well into its decline, who carried within their lifetimes the memory of what the place had been, and witnessed what it was becoming. There are veterans of the Civil War on both sides, men who fought in the great conflict that reshaped the nation, and who returned, those who survived, to a town that was already diminished and that continued to diminish around them through their remaining years. To stand in this cemetery on a quiet morning, when the light is coming low through the trees and the river air is cool and damp and fragrant with the particular smell of bottomland vegetation, is to feel the full weight of what has happened here. The town that surrounded this cemetery, when it was active, is gone in all but the most vestigial traces. The community that built it and maintained it and brought its dead to it has dispersed across the decades and the distances of American history. The political ambitions, the commercial dreams, the private joys and sorrows of the people buried here, all of it has dissolved into the silence that now prevails on the peninsula between the rivers. But the cemetery itself persists, and the columns persist, and the streets persist in their subtle topographic traces. And the rivers persist most of all, as unchanged in their fundamental character by everything that has happened on their banks, still meeting at the point of their confluence with the same patient indifference they have always brought to the human dramas played out beside them. The Alabama River bends around the southern edge of the peninsula as it has always bent, receiving the Cahaba from the east as it has always received it, carrying their combined waters south toward Mobile as it has always done, regardless of whether a capital city stood on the land between them, or a prison, or a prosperous commercial town, or nothing at all. The river's indifference is not cold, it is simply absolute. The water that moves past the ruins of Cahaba today is not the same water that flooded the streets of the capital in 1821, or that entered the stockade of Castle Morgan in 1864, or that finally persuaded the last families to leave. It is new water, always new water, drawn from the rainfall of the most recent storms, moving through the same channel toward the same destination, connected to all the water that has moved through this channel before it, only by the fact of continuity, the fact that the river goes on even when everything else changes. There is a path that runs from the parking area at the historic site, along the edge of the peninsula, toward the confluence of the rivers, and this path passes through the heart of what was once the town's main residential and commercial district. Walking it slowly, and in the manner that the place seems to require, one encounters at intervals the various markers and interpretive signs that the state has placed to explain what cannot otherwise be seen. Here was the courthouse. Here was a major commercial establishment. Here was the site of the Capitol building, the first home of Alabama's state government, now indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain, except by the sign that identifies it. The ground underfoot along this path has a slightly uneven quality that suggests the presence of foundations beneath the surface. The compressed rubble of old brick and mortar lying below the roots and the leaf litter, not deep, but below the threshold of casual visibility. Archaeological investigation of the site has revealed this subsurface history in considerable detail. The shapes of buildings recovered from the soil by patient excavation. The artifacts of daily life recovered from what were once cellars and middens. Pottery fragments and glass and hardware, and the small objects that accumulate in the spaces where people live and work, and that persist in the earth long after the people have gone. These artifacts, now catalogued and stored and partially displayed, are the most intimate record of what Cahaba was. They are the things that people actually used in their daily lives, the plates they ate from, and the bottles they drank from, and the tools they worked with, and the buttons they wore on their clothing. They are more specific than any document, more immediate than any legislative record, because they bear the physical evidence of use. The wear patterns and the breakage and the accumulated grime that objects acquire through human handling. They were discarded or lost by people who had no thought that they would ever be found and examined, and their recovery from the earth feels like an act of recovery in a deeper sense, the recovery of the materiality of lives that history has otherwise abstracted into names and dates and official records. The Spanish moss that hangs from the oaks throughout the site moves with the same slow rhythm it has always moved with, responding to whatever air moves over the peninsula from the rivers or from the open sky above. It is not a plant that thinks about history. It grows where conditions permit and falls where conditions fail it, and moves in the air in the patterns that its weight and its attachment require, entirely indifferent to the fact that it has been hanging from these particular trees, or their predecessors over the full span of Cahawba's history. It was here before the surveyors came and laid out the grid of streets, and it will be here after the last interpretive sign has weathered beyond legibility, and it connects the current moment to every previous moment on this peninsula in the only way that natural things connect moments, by simply continuing to be what they have always been. The morning mist that rises from the rivers in the cool months settles on the site with a particular density that the low ground and the proximity of the water produce. It fills the spaces between the trees and obscures the sight lines along the old street traces, wrapping the columns in a soft opacity that makes them look like apparitions, or like something that is not entirely present in the material world. In this mist, on these mornings, Cahawba is closest to itself, closest to the quality of a place that exists between what it was and what it has become, suspended in the ambiguity of ruins, neither entirely gone, nor in any meaningful sense still here. The visitors who come to Cahawba today come with various purposes and various expectations. Some come as historians or archaeologists, with professional interest in the site's documented past and its material remains. Some come as genealogists, looking for the graves of ancestors or the traces of family histories connected to the town. Some come as tourists drawn by the reputation of the place as one of the more evocative ruins in the American South, seeking the particular aesthetic experience that abandoned places provide. And some come, perhaps, simply because they have heard of the place and want to see what a vanished town looks like, want to stand in the space where history concentrated itself and then dispersed, want to feel whatever it is that such places make people feel. What they find in any season and at any time of day is a quietness that has to be experienced to be understood. It is not simply the absence of the sounds that a living town would produce, though it is that also. It is the presence of a different kind of sound, the sound of the forest and the rivers, the birds that inhabit the tree canopy, the movement of water, the occasional creak of a branch in the wind. These sounds are not silent in the ordinary sense, but they are sounds without human purpose, sounds that are indifferent to the presence of any observer, and sounds that continue whether anyone is listening or not. Standing on what was once Capitol Street, or what was once the main commercial thoroughfare, or at the edge of the riverbank where the steamboat landing once received its regular traffic of boats and goods and people, one stands in the complete absence of everything that made those places what they were. The legislature does not meet. The merchants do not trade. The boats do not come. The streets carry no one. What remains is the earth and the water and the sky and the vegetation that grows where buildings once stood, and it is sufficient in its way, sufficient to suggest to the imagination the contours of what has gone, but insufficient to recover it, to make it present in any sense that the body can apprehend. This is the specific quality of Cahawba, the quality that distinguishes it from many other historic sites where the structures have been preserved or reconstructed, where the past has been maintained in something like its original form. At Cahawba, the past is genuinely past, genuinely absent, preserved only in the earth and in the documents, and in the imagination of those who take the time to learn what happened here. There are no restored buildings to walk through, no period furnishings to examine, no guides in period costume to animate the historical scene. There is the ground, and the trees, and the rivers, and the occasional standing remnant, and the silence in which all of it exists. The Corinthian columns that rise from the vegetation are visible from the path at a distance that allows them to be apprehended in their full incongruity. Their classical European architectural vocabulary entirely out of place in the Alabama forest. Their height exaggerated by the fact that there is nothing around them of comparable scale, no remaining walls or adjacent buildings to provide the context in which their proportions were originally intelligible. They stand at the edge of comprehension, these columns, at the boundary between the historical and the natural, belonging in a sense to neither world, relics of a human ambition that the natural world has surrounded and outlasted, but not yet entirely absorbed. The brick well that stands near the center of the old residential district is another of the site's prominent surviving features. A low circular structure of hand-laid brick that once provided water to the households in its vicinity. It still exists as a three-dimensional object, still retains its circular form, still presents to the eye the craft of the bricklayers who built it, the careful coursing and the mortar joints that have survived remarkably well despite the moisture and the vegetation. Looking into it is looking into the darkness that is both literal and historical, a shaft going down into the earth where the water table sits, drawing from the same aquifer that watered the horses and the people of the town in its living years, a continuous geological feature that has not changed while everything above it has been transformed. The well was built to serve a need, and the need it served was the most fundamental need that any community has. The need for water in sufficient quantity and of sufficient cleanliness to sustain human life. The irony that a town drowned by too much water from its rivers should have needed a well for its drinking water is not lost on anyone who thinks about it. The river water was unsuitable for drinking, contaminated by its own silt and by whatever ran into it from the upstream drainage, and so the town needed to draw from the ground rather than from the surface, needed to go down below the floods to find water that was usable. The well is in some ways the most honest monument at Cahawba, the most direct expression of the basic relationship between the town and the physical circumstances of its existence. The light changes through the course of a day at Cahawba in ways that change the character of the place more dramatically than might be expected from a site where so little varies from one visit to the next. In the early morning, when the mist is still on the river and the sun is coming in low from the east, the quality of the light is soft and golden, and the shadows are long, and the dew on the vegetation catches the light in small bright points that are beautiful in a way that seems incongruous with the historical weight of the place. In the midday hours, the canopy diffuses the light into something more neutral and even, a light that flattens the topographic details and makes the old street traces harder to read, that reduces the ruins to their most abstract forms. In the afternoon, as the sun moves toward the west and begins to fall toward the horizon, the light takes on a warmer tone and the shadows return from a different angle, and the whole site takes on a different set of emphases. The ruins that were hidden in midday shadow now illuminated, the clear ground in midday now shadowed. These changes are entirely natural, the ordinary progression of light through a day, unremarkable in any other context. But at a site where the human-made elements are so few and so fragmentary, where the landscape is doing most of the work of creating meaning, the quality of the light becomes more significant than it would be at a fully realized historic preservation site. The light is doing interpretive work here, shaping what can be seen and what must be imagined, suggesting at certain times of day a richness and complexity of the historical scene that the sober daylight would not support. The seasons change Cahawba profoundly in ways that the physical remains cannot change. In the deep summer, when the Alabama heat and humidity reach their annual apex, The vegetation of the site is at its most luxuriant and most obscuring, the canopy so full and the understory so dense that the old street traces are nearly invisible and the surviving ruins barely penetrate through the green. The site in summer has a tropical heaviness, a sense of the vegetation pressing in from every side with an organic enthusiasm that the thin record of human habitation cannot withstand. It is easy in summer to understand why people left. The heat alone is a persuasive argument for departure, and the heat combined with the mosquitoes that breed in the river margins and the standing water of the low ground is an argument that presses itself upon the body with an insistence that the mind has difficulty countering. In autumn, as the leaves begin to turn and then to fall, the sight opens up in ways that summer conceals. The canopy thins, and the light reaches the ground at angles that the full-leaved summer prevented, and the old street traces that were invisible in August become visible in November, readable by anyone with patience and a willingness to look at the landscape with the specific question of what it has been. The ruins that are shrouded in summer become more exposed in the bare autumn and winter landscape, their forms cleaner against the sky, their contexts more apparent. It is in the bare months that Cahawba most fully reveals its historical geometry, the evidence of what was built here most legible in the ground and in the surviving remnants. Winter brings a particular quality to the site, a grey and muted quality that suits the subject. The bare trees stand in their winter forms against skies that are often overcast and low, and the rivers run at various levels depending on the rainfall of the preceding weeks, sometimes low and clear between their banks, sometimes high and turbid with the promise of overflow. The cemetery in winter has a bleakness that the summer's green softens, the stones standing exposed and distinct against the pale ground, the inscriptions sharp in the flat winter light. The columns in winter have a starkness that makes them more architectural and less picturesque than they appear in summer. More like the remnants of a building and less like a composition of natural and human elements. Spring is perhaps the most complex season at Cahawba, because spring is when the flood risk is highest, and when the vegetation returns with a speed and completeness that can seem almost violent. The rivers respond to the winter and early spring rains with their periodic rises, and the low ground of the peninsula absorbs the overflow with the same passivity with which it has absorbed floods for as long as the rivers have been running. The green returns to the site as if to claim it back from winter's relative legibility, the canopy filling in and the understory thickening, and the ground-level vegetation reaching up toward the light that the bare months had allowed to reach all the way to the earth. It is in spring, watching the vegetation recover its summer fullness, that the mechanism of Cahawba's final disappearance is most viscerally apparent. The plant life is not doing anything to Cahawba that it would not do anywhere. It is simply growing as plants grow, following the sun and the moisture and the nutrients in the soil, indifferent to what the soil contains below the rooting depth. But the cumulative effect of this indifference, applied over decades without the counterforce of human maintenance, has been to reduce the town to its current state, to cover over and root through and pull down and obscure everything that human hands built here, returning the land to something closer to what it was before the surveyors arrived in 1819 with their transits and their notebooks. The archaeology of the site is, in a sense, a contest against this process of natural erasure, an effort to recover from the earth the record that the forest has been covering. Excavations conducted at various times by the University of Alabama and other institutions have revealed the footprints of buildings, the contents of privies and middens, the artifacts of daily life buried beneath the accumulation of organic material that the forest floor produces. These investigations have produced both specific knowledge of the site's material history and a more general appreciation of how much information can be preserved in the earth of a place that has been abandoned for a century and a half. The artifacts recovered from Cahawba span the full chronological range of the site's occupation, from the earlier settlement period in the 1810s and 1820s through the Civil War period and into the post-war decades of decline. They include the ceramics that allow archaeologists to date occupation layers precisely, the transfer-printed English pottery, and the American-made wares that changed in style and availability through the decades of the town's life. They include the glass of windows and bottles, the iron of tools and hardware, the brick of foundations and chimneys. They include occasionally the more personal objects, the items of personal adornment or domestic sentiment that were not discarded as trash, but were lost or abandoned in the circumstances of departure or decay. Each of these objects is a small window into the life that was lived at Cahawba, a fragment of the material world that the town's residents inhabited. The transfer-printed plate was part of a table setting in a household that set a proper table, that observed the rituals of domestic life that the era prescribed for respectable households. The bottle was part of the daily pharmacopoeia of a family trying to maintain health in conditions that undermined it, as the iron hardware was part of a building that stood on the town's main street and housed a business or a family, or perhaps both. Each object was made somewhere else and brought to Cahawba by the networks of trade that connected this remote Alabama town to the wider world, and each object ended its useful life on this peninsula and returned to its constituent elements in the earth, and each object recovered from that earth tells something about the life that was lived between its making and its burial. The Confederate prison records, such as they survive, and the Union prisoner diaries and memoirs that have been published over the decades since the war, constitute a different kind of archive for Cahawba's history, one focused with particular intensity on the years between 1863 and 1865. These records are emotionally demanding in ways that the archaeological evidence is not, because they speak directly of suffering, of the experience of captivity and hunger and illness, and the slow erosion of hope that prolonged confinement produces. Reading them is encountering the human cost of the circumstances that Castle Morgan represented, a cost measured in the specific suffering of individuals who had names and families and lives that extended far beyond the confines of the Alabama prison. The men who wrote these accounts were not professional writers, most of them, but men who felt the need to record what they had experienced, either because they believed it historically significant or because the act of writing was itself a way of processing what had happened to them. Their prose is sometimes rough and sometimes eloquent and always specific, grounded in the physical details of the place and the experience in ways that make the reader feel the reality of what is being described. The cold of the Alabama winter in an inadequately heated building, the smell of the compound in the summer heat, the sound of the river when it rose and began coming over the stockade fence, the faces of companions who were well in October and dead by January. These are not abstractions. They are the immediate record of human suffering in a specific place, and that place is the same ground that visitors walk on today when they follow the path along the riverbank at the Cahawba Historic Site. There is something that occurs when one stands on ground where significant suffering has taken place and knows that it has taken place there. It is not a supernatural apprehension, not a communication from the past in any literal sense. It is rather the effect of knowledge on perception, the way that knowing what happened in a place changes how the place looks and feels to the person who knows it. The riverbank at Cahawba looks different to someone who has read the prisoner accounts than it looks to someone who has not. The same trees, the same water, the same Alabama sky, but inflected by knowledge into something more resonant, more morally weighted, more demanding of attention. This is part of what historic sites exist to produce. This transformation of landscape by knowledge. And at this conversion of ordinary ground into ground, that means something because of what happened on it. The interpretive signs at Cahawba attempt to perform this transformation for visitors who come without prior knowledge, condensing the complex history of the place into brief texts that gesture toward the fuller story. But the fuller story requires more than signs can provide, requires the time and the engagement with primary sources, and the imaginative investment that transforms historical information into historical understanding. The historical understanding of Cahawba is an understanding of contingency, of the way that outcomes that seem inevitable in retrospect were not inevitable at all, that the particular fate of this town was the product of specific decisions and specific physical circumstances and specific historical forces that could have been otherwise at many points. If the rivers had flooded less severely, the capital might have stayed. If the railroad had run through the peninsula rather than bypassing it, the commercial decline might have been arrested. If the surrounding agricultural economy had developed differently, if the Civil War had not occurred, when it did or as it did, if any number of other variables had been different, Cahawba might have become a prosperous Alabama city rather than an archaeological park in the forest between two rivers. But the rivers flooded as they flood, and the railroad went where it went, and the war came as it came, and the town declined as it declined, and the last families left when they left, and the forest reclaimed the peninsula with the thoroughness that forests display when given adequate time. The contingency of it is not comforting exactly, because it implies that the suffering of the people who lived and died here, who invested their lives in a place that ultimately rejected their investment, was the product of circumstances rather than of any larger meaning or purpose. But the contingency is also honest, is closer to the truth of how human communities come and go than any narrative of inevitability would be. Communities come and go. They are established in places that seem propitious and built with materials and ambitions that seem sufficient. And they prosper for a time, or they struggle for a time, or they do both in succession, and then they end. And sometimes the ending is dramatic and sudden, a disaster that removes the population overnight and leaves the physical structure intact as a monument to sudden cessation. More often, the ending is gradual, as it was at Cahawba, a slow bleeding of population and purpose over decades, a diminishment so steady that at any given moment the town seems still to exist, just smaller, just quieter, just a little more worn, until one day there is no one left, and what was a town has become something else. What Cahawba has become is a kind of memory palace, a place where the past is stored in the form of physical traces that must be interpreted to be understood. The traces themselves are humble, the depressions of old streets, the foundations below the earth, the standing columns and the brick well, and the gravestones of the cemetery. They are humble, but they are real, are the actual physical residue of the actual physical life of an actual place. And that reality gives them a weight that no reconstruction or representation could replicate. The mist of a Cahawba morning settles on these traces without distinction, covering the ruins of the capital and the ruins of the prison and the ruins of the commercial district and the cemetery with the same soft opacity, making no distinction between the historically significant and the historically marginal, between the suffering and the prosperity, between the ambition and the failure. The mist is indifferent to the history, as the rivers are indifferent, as the forest is indifferent, as time itself is indifferent to the particular meanings that human beings assign to particular moments and places. But the indifference of natural processes is not the same as meaninglessness. A place where an entire American town was built and inhabited and lost to the rivers and the forest and the movements of history is a place that carries meaning whether or not the natural world acknowledges it. The meaning is carried in the human record, in the documents and the artifacts and the accounts of those who live there, in the gravestones of the dead, in the memories that passed from generation to generation until they thinned and dispersed as all memories eventually do. The meaning is also carried in the landscape itself, in the way the ground has been shaped by human use and by the water that exceeded that use, in the visible record of what a community leaves behind when it goes. Standing at the confluence of the Alabama and the Cahaba rivers, at the very point of the peninsula where the two waters meet, one stands at the place where all of this began and where all of it continues in the form of its absence. The rivers move. They have always moved. They will continue to move when the last trace of the town's physical presence has been dissolved, and when the memory of the place has thinned to the point where only specialists know it ever existed. The rivers have no opinion about what happened between them. They are simply rivers, doing what rivers do, which is to carry water from higher ground to lower ground, from the interior to the sea, from the past to the future, dissolving everything that they touch and depositing it somewhere else, perpetually in motion, perpetually indifferent, perpetually continuing. Or if the columns at Cahaba stand in the forest and accept whatever weather comes to them, accept the rain and the flooding and the moss and the roots and the weight of accumulated seasons, standing because they were built to stand and because nothing has yet happened with sufficient force to bring them down. They are not symbols in any deliberate sense. They were built to hold up a roof, to support a structure of human habitation. And the roof is gone, and the structure is gone, and the habitation is long gone, but the columns themselves remain in the earth and rise through the canopy with the perseverance of objects that have no alternative to perseverance, that simply endure, because endurance is all that matter can do. Entire communities can disappear. This is the lesson of Cahaba, stated in the plainest possible terms. Not the lesson that communities disappear because of some moral failure or some divine judgment, but the simpler and perhaps more frightening lesson that communities disappear because the circumstances that sustain them change in ways that exceed the community's capacity to adapt, because rivers flood and railroads go elsewhere, and wars end and populations follow opportunity, and time continues regardless. The disappearance of a community is not a tragedy in the sense of a drama with villains and victims, and a moral to be extracted. It is closer to a natural process, as the return of the forest to the peninsula is a natural process, as the movement of the river is a natural process, governed by forces that operate on scales larger than any human community and longer than any human memory. What remains at Cahaba is what remains at the end of natural processes and historical processes working in combination over many generations. The earth, shaped by what was built upon it, the stone and brick that time has not yet consumed, the cemetery where the dead are still named, the rivers that made the place and unmade it, and the silence, the particular silence of a place that has been a town and is no longer a town, a silence that is the acoustic equivalent of the landscape's visual message that says in the register of sound what the ruins say in the register of sight, that something was here, that it is gone, that the going left traces, that the traces will themselves eventually be gone, and that the rivers will still be moving when all of it is finished.